The gun pressed cold against the back of her neck, and the man holding it smelled like whiskey and old cruelty. "You are going to sign those papers," Gerald Holt said, his voice slick and smooth the way rot could be smooth when it had been at something long enough. "Or I am going to make sure every soul in Reed Rock County knows what kind of woman you really are. Difficult, defiant, damaged goods nobody in their right mind would ever want." Clara Merritt did not move. She stood at the center of the Red Rock Sheriff's office, her hands flat on the wooden desk, the land deed pressed beneath her palms, and she could feel the weight of every choice she had ever made settling on her shoulders like iron. The lamp on the desk threw amber light across the deed. Her father's signature was on the bottom line. Her mother's grave sat on the northeastern corner of that property. And Gerald Holt was going to take all of it because he had decided that a woman alone, a woman with a sharp tongue and a sharper mind, was easy to break. "Every man I have ever tried to rely on has told me I am too much trouble," Clara said, and her voice did not shake. It never shook. That was one of the things people hated about her. Too opinionated, too stubborn, too difficult to love. They walked away and thought they were punishing me. Gerald pressed the barrel harder. "Sign it." "I have not finished." She turned slowly, because she refused to give him the satisfaction of her fear, and she looked him in the eye. "You are the sixth man to point something at me this year, Gerald. You are going to be the last." The door behind Gerald came open with a crack like a rifle shot. Fletcher Boone stepped through it. 6 feet and 2 inches of sun-darkened trouble, his duster still carrying the dust from the Amarillo Road, his dark eyes moving from the gun to Clara, to Gerald with the unhurried assessment of a man who had seen worse and handled it. He was not particularly loud when he spoke. He never needed to be. "Put the gun down," Fletcher said. Gerald turned, startled, and in that half-second Clara swept the land deed off the desk, folded it once and tucked it inside her bodice. It was not a graceful move. It was a practical one. She had learned the difference early. Fletcher crossed the room in 4 strides, took the gun from Gerald's hand with a motion so clean and practiced it looked effortless, and ejected the cylinder with a soft metallic click that sounded very loud in the small room. Gerald was sputtering. "She is a thieving, lying, impossible woman who has no right to that land, and no man in this county will stand up for her, because she has driven every one of them away with her mouth and her pride in her." "Good," Fletcher said. Gerald stopped. Clara stopped. Fletcher set the emptied revolver on the desk, looked at Gerald Holt with a patience that somehow managed to be more threatening than anger, and said it again. "Good. A woman like her doesn't need men lining up to hand her soft words. She needs one man who can keep up." He looked at Clara then, briefly, just a glance. "Go on out front, Miss Merritt. I'll handle the rest of this." Clara Merritt, who had never in her 26 years on this earth done a single thing simply because a man told her to, walked out the door. She stood on the plank sidewalk in the last light of a Texas evening in the year 1878, the land deed against her heart, and she tried very hard to understand what had just happened. She had been in Red Rock for 3 weeks by then. She had come from Abilene, which she had left because of a man, though she hated to admit that even to herself. His name had been Thomas Greaves, and he had been kind for 8 months, and then he had stood in her parlor with his hat in his hands and told her in a gentle, regretful voice that she was simply too much for him. Too intense, too certain of her own opinions, too unwilling to soften herself at the right moments. He had said he admired her, genuinely, and that he wished her well. Then he had walked out her door and married a woman named Dora who smiled constantly and never argued about anything. Before Thomas, there had been Samuel Price, who had lasted 4 months and said she argued too much. Before Samuel, There had been Edward Marsh, who had lasted 2 months and said she frightened him a little, which he meant as an explanation, and she had taken as a compliment, though she had tried not to show it. She had come to Red Rock because her father's land was here, 40 acres of good grass and a creek that ran clean 9 months of the year, land that had come to her after her father's death 6 months prior. She had come to work it, to build something that was hers, and to do it without the help of any man who might later decide she was too much trouble and walk away. She had not planned on Gerald Holt, who had been circling that land for 2 years before her father died, and who had clearly decided that a single woman would be considerably easier to remove than the old man had been. She had not planned on Fletcher Boone at all. She learned his name that evening when he came out of the sheriff's office and stood beside her on the sidewalk. He had Gerald Holt's gun in his coat pocket and a thoughtful expression on his face, and he introduced himself simply. "Fletcher Boone. I work for Judge Albright over in Calhoun County." "Doing what?" Clara asked. "Depends on what needs doing." She looked him over the way she looked over everything, which was to say carefully and without apology. He was perhaps 28 or 29, lean but not thin, the kind of man who had been outdoors his entire life and showed it. His face was angular and weathered, and currently set in an expression of mild amusement that she found slightly irritating. He wore a Colt revolver on his right hip and a Bowie knife on his left, and he wore both of them the way other men wore boots, which was to say as if he had been born with them and would die with them and didn't think about them in between. "You heard what he said about me," Clara said. "It was not a question, some of it, and you said good." "I did. Most men say that as an insult when they're making a point. You did not say it that way." Fletcher looked at her steadily. "I didn't mean it that way." "Then what did you mean?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at Red Rock's Main Street, which was modest even by 1878 Texas standards. There was a general store, a livery, a boarding house, a saloon called the Copper Crown, a small church at the far end, and the kind of dusty space between buildings that collected everything a town didn't quite know what to do with. The evening star was coming up over the ridge to the west. "I meant that a woman who makes weak men uncomfortable probably has something worth protecting," Fletcher said, "and that the problem has never been her." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You do not know anything about me. Not yet." It was the "not yet" that she carried with her when she walked to the boarding house that night. Not yet. Like a promise made sideways, without pressure, without demand. Not yet implied that he intended to learn. She was not sure whether to be irritated or intrigued. She was, as it turned out, quite thoroughly both. The next morning she went to her land. She had been going every day since arriving in Red Rock, usually alone, usually on the mare she had bought in Abilene, a steady chestnut animal named Patience who had earned the name. She rode the 4 miles out to the property and sat at the fence line her father had built and looked at the house. He had never quite finished and thought about what it would cost to make it livable, and what it would cost to stock 40 acres, and what Gerald Holt was likely to try next. She did not expect to find Fletcher Boone already there. He was standing at the south corner of the fence with a notebook and a length of measuring cord, making notes in a precise, unhurried hand. He had his horse, a large bay gelding, ground hitched nearby. He looked up when she arrived but did not stop writing. "You're measuring my fence," Clara said. "I'm measuring where the fence should be," he replied. "Holt's been moving the markers. That southeast corner is 2 yards off from the deed." Clara dismounted and came to look at the notebook. His handwriting was unexpectedly neat. "How do you know where it should be?" "Because I rode out this morning and found the original survey stakes from 1869. Someone tried to pull the northeast one. They didn't get it all the way out." He showed her the notebook page. Your southeastern corner is here. Holt's cattle have been grazing here. He indicated the discrepancy with a line. That is evidence, Clara said. It is. You went looking for it. I did. She studied him. Why, you said you work for Judge Albright. Is this official business? Fletcher closed the notebook. The morning was bright and already warm, the Texas sky an enormous flat blue above the grass, and there was a meadowlark somewhere nearby making its untroubled sound. Judge Albright sent me to Red Rock because he's been hearing things about Holt for a while. Land disputes. Two homesteaders who sold their claims under what the judge considers suspicious circumstances. Your situation is one of several, he paused, but I would have helped anyway. Because I am a woman alone and you thought I needed rescuing, Clara said, and she said it flatly, not with heat, just laying it down to see what he did with it. No, Fletcher said. He said it without irritation, without defensiveness, the way a man says a simple fact. Because Holt pointed a gun at someone who was minding her own business, and because the land is yours and he has no right to it. That has nothing to do with you being alone or a woman. It has to do with right and wrong. Clara was quiet for a moment. Most men who say that mean the first thing. I know, Fletcher said. I'm not most men. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and went to look at the house. The house was a one-story wooden structure with a covered porch that her father had clearly intended to be something more. The bones of it were sound. The roof needed work on the western side. The windows were intact, but two of the panes had developed cracks, and one shutter hung at an angle that would be the first thing she fixed, because it bothered her every time she looked at it. Inside there was a main room, a kitchen area, two smaller rooms at the back. The floor was solid plank, dust-covered but solid. The fireplace was stone, well built, her father's careful work. She stood in the main room and thought about her mother, who had died when Clara was 12, and her father, who had built this place with his own hands after her mother was gone, who had talked about it in letters for 10 years as the thing he was building for his daughter, the thing she would have after him. He had died in December with the roof still unfinished because the winter had come early, and he had been 63 and worn out, and the winter had won. She heard Fletcher's boots on the porch, the particular sound of a man trying to walk quietly and mostly succeeding. The roof on the west side needs new shingles, he said from the doorway. Maybe a day's work, 2 if the underlayment is rotted. I know what it needs, Clara said. I know you do. He came in, looked around, looked at the fireplace the way one craftsman appreciates another's work. Your father built this. Yes, he knew what he was doing. Yes, Clara said, he did. She turned to look at Fletcher. I am going to stay here. I want to be clear about that. I am not going to be frightened off my land, and I am not going to sell it at any price. I know that puts me in Holt's way, and I know that is uncomfortable. And I know most people in Red Rock are going to wait to see which way the wind blows before they decide to be helpful. I just want you to know what you are getting into before you spend any more of your time on my fence corners. Fletcher looked at her with that same steady, unhurried quality that she was beginning to identify as entirely specific to him. Not patience exactly, more like the confidence of a man who had a very clear idea of what he intended to do and was in no particular hurry about it. Miss Merritt. I have been working for Judge Albright for 4 years. I have gone into 3 towns where the local power had spent years making itself comfortable, and I have gathered the evidence the judge needed to bring charges, and then I have stayed until those charges stuck. The last time I did it, a man named Decker tried to have me shot twice and had my horse stolen once. He glanced at the bay through the window. I got the horse back. I am not easily discouraged, Clara said after a moment. Clara, pardon my name, it's Clara. If you are going to be measuring my fence, You might as well use my name." "Fletcher," he said, and the small shift in the room was so subtle she almost missed it. The way the light changes 1 degree warmer in the late afternoon, and you look up and realize the season has been turning all along. The following 2 weeks were, on the surface, practical. Fletcher filed an affidavit with the county surveyor documenting the displaced fence markers. Clara filed a formal complaint against Gerald Holt with the county recorder, citing interference with property rights. Judge Albright, 40 miles away in Calhoun County, sent a letter acknowledging both and indicating that he would be traveling to Red Rock in approximately 3 weeks to review the matter. 3 weeks felt very long when Gerald Holt was watching from across the street every time Clara went to the general store. She stayed at the boarding house, run by a woman named Edith Farlow, who was 60 years old, had outlived 2 husbands and 1 business partner, and had the kind of opinions about everything that Clara found deeply refreshing. Edith had been in Red Rock for 11 years. She knew where every body was buried, figuratively speaking, and a few literally. And she shared her knowledge with the careful economy of a woman who understood the value of information. "Holt's been in this county for 8 years, Edith told Clara one evening, sitting on the boarding house porch with coffee going cold in their cups. The night was warm, which was September in Texas, and the stars were enormous. Came in with money from somewhere, nobody ever found out where, bought up the first 3 homesteads inside a year. The families that sold said later they'd felt pressured, but none of them could prove anything. He owns the bank note on about 1/4 of the businesses on that main street. He's got the current sheriff, man named Cruz, well enough in his pocket that Cruz looks the other way at considerable expense. What about Fletcher? Can Holt get to him?" Edith looked at her sidelong. "Fletcher Boone is harder to get to than most. He grew up in hard country, came up through the cattle drives when he was young, worked his way to working for the law because he actually cares about it, which is rarer than it should be. He does not drink excessively, does not gamble, does not keep bad company. He has 1 friend in Red Rock, Jim Tate, who runs the livery from the old trail days, and that's about it." She paused. "He's been asking around about you, you know." "What kind of asking?" "The kind where he acts like he's asking about the land dispute and ends up asking about you. What you're like, what your history is, where you came from." Edith smiled into her coffee cup. "Sila's at the general store said he asked if you had family nearby and seemed relieved when Sila's said you had a cousin up in Amarillo." Clara was quiet for a moment, watching the stars. "He is here on official business. That is all." Said Edith Farlow, which managed to contain a great deal of skepticism in a very small sound. Fletcher had taken a room at the Copper Crown, which also had a few rooms above the saloon for travelers who were not particular about the noise. He was, as far as Clara could tell, neither a drinking man nor a gambling man, but he seemed to find the saloon useful for other purposes, which was to say that men talked in saloons, and Fletcher listened with the same unhurried attention he gave to everything. He came to the property with her 3 mornings out of 7 that first week, and 4 mornings out of 7 the second week, and she found herself, which was unexpected, not minding. She had spent years minding when men came to help, because men coming to help always came with the price of their opinions about what she should do, how she should do it, whether her judgment could be trusted. Fletcher came with tools and measurements, and occasionally a question, asked directly, about what she wanted and what she intended, and then he listened to the answer as if it were information worth having. On a Wednesday morning in the second week, they were assessing what would need to happen to make the house livable before winter. She had a list. He had his notebook. "I can do the roof myself with the right lumber," she said. I need to place an order at the mill in Calhoun. The shingles will take 2 weeks to come. I can do the roof, Fletcher said. I know you can, so can I. He did not argue. He wrote something in his notebook. The well is clean. I checked it yesterday. I know the well is clean. I checked it Monday. She looked at him. He was not, she noticed, defensive about the overlap. He just nodded and crossed something off. Why did you cross something off? I had written down to check the well. Since you already have, there's no need. She looked at his notebook. It was, she discovered, a comprehensive list of every structural element of the property, assessed and noted, prioritized in order of urgency. It was exactly the kind of list she would have made. She said, before she thought about whether to say it, that is a very logical way to approach this. He looked up. Did you expect otherwise? Most people I have worked alongside want to be admired for their work. You just want to get it done. Getting it done is the admirable part, Fletcher said. He said it matter-of-factly, not as a philosophy, just as a statement about what he believed. And she felt something shift very slightly in her chest, something that she had been keeping carefully balanced for a long time. She looked away at the fence line. Holt's men rode the boundary road this morning when I was coming out. 3 of them. They didn't say anything, just rode parallel to me until I turned in. Fletcher's expression did not change much, but something behind his eyes went quieter, which she was learning meant his attention had sharpened. How far did they go? To the property line. Then they turned back. How long ago? An hour. She looked at him directly. I am telling you because it is information that may be relevant to your work, not because I need you to go confront them. I know, he said. I mean it. Clara. He said her name with a kind of careful steadiness that made it feel like something deliberate, not casual. I heard you. She believed him, which was a new and slightly alarming thing to experience. That evening she was at the boarding house writing a letter to her cousin Margaret in Amarillo, updating Margaret on the land situation, when someone knocked on the boarding house door with a force that rattled the windows. Clara was closer to the door than Edith, who was in the kitchen, and she opened it. 2 of Holt's men stood on the porch. She recognized them from the morning. They were large in the particular way of men who made a living at intimidation. Mr. Holt wants to talk, the larger one said. Mr. Holt can write a letter, Clara said. He means tonight. He means no. She started to close the door. The larger man put his hand against it. Miss Merritt, don't make this difficult. I have heard that before, Clara said. And she said it with a calm that was completely genuine, because she had heard it before many times. And she had learned that men who expected her to crumble when they said it were thrown entirely off balance when she didn't. You can tell Mr. Holt that I do not have conversations about my property with men who send other men to my door at night. He can speak to Judge Albright in 3 weeks. The man pushed the door harder. Clara did not step back. Edith Farlow appeared from the kitchen holding a double-barreled shotgun with the ease of a woman for whom this was not an unusual circumstance. That's Mrs. Farlow's boarding house, Edith said, and I'd thank you to take your hand off her door. The 2 men looked at the shotgun and then at each other and then left. Clara shut the door. Thank you, she said to Edith. I have had that shotgun for 9 years, Edith said, returning to the kitchen. I have pointed it at 9 different men. I have not yet had to fire it. I consider that a record worth maintaining. Clara went back to her letter to Margaret and described what had just happened, and then set the letter down and sat with her hands still and thought about the fact that she had not been afraid. Not because she was brave exactly, though she thought she was reasonably brave, but because she had stopped, somewhere in the last several years, expecting anyone to save her, and that had made fear a different kind of thing. Fear was information now. It told her where the danger was, and she used it accordingly. The next morning Fletcher was at the livery when she went to get patients, and she told him about Holt's men coming to the boarding house, and he was quiet for a moment. In that way that meant he was measuring something. "He's escalating because he's worried," Fletcher said. "The affidavit we filed put him on notice that the judge is paying attention. He wants to resolve this before Albright gets here." "Can he?" "Legally, not legally. Which means he'll try unlawfully and try to make it look otherwise." He looked at her. "I want to send a message to Judge Albright to move up his arrival. 2 weeks is too long." "Do that," Clara said. "And in the meantime, we work the property as visibly as possible during daylight, and you don't go out alone after dark." She started to bristle, and he saw it and said, "Not because you can't handle yourself. Because Holt's men are not interested in a fair argument, and there is no shame in not being shot." She considered this. "That is logical. I'm trying to be." They rode out together that morning, and they spent the day repairing the fence on the southeastern corner, the section closest to Holt's property. It was hard, physical work, digging new post holes and setting the posts and stringing wire, and Clara did her portion of it without comment and without asking for adjustments. She had grown up on a working farm before her mother died, had spent summers with her father until she was sent to a school in Houston at 14, and the knowledge of physical work had never left her hands. Fletcher watched her work without making a point of it, which she appreciated. He simply worked alongside her, and they fell into a rhythm that was more comfortable than she wanted to admit. The way two people fall into rhythm when they are both competent and neither is trying to impress the other. At noon, they ate from the food she had brought, sitting on the tailgate of the small wagon she had hired from the livery. He ate dried beef and cornbread with the straightforward appreciation of a man who had eaten worse, and the absence of ceremony that she found she liked. "How did you end up working for Judge Albright?" she asked. Fletcher looked at the grass for a moment. "My father ranched in West Texas. Good land, good cattle. When I was 20, a man named Purvis came in with money and lawyers and started buying up land by any means available. He got 6 ranches in 3 years. He tried to get ours, and my father wouldn't sell, so Purvis had 2 of his men destroy our water source, which in West Texas in July is a death sentence for cattle." He said it flatly, just stating facts. "My father lost 400 head. He salvaged what he could and sold out the next year, not to Purvis, but still, he never went back. What happened to Purvis, Judge Albright happened. Another family brought a case that stuck. Purvis went to prison in 1872. He looked at her. "Albright sent me a letter because someone had told him I was asking around about Purvis after it was over. He said if I was interested in making that kind of thing happen properly, he'd work. So I went." Clara was quiet for a moment. "And your father?" "He's in New Mexico now with my mother. Raising fewer cattle and more vegetables. He says he prefers it." Something passed across his face that was fond and a little sad and gone quickly. "He's doing well." "My mother is buried on this land," Clara said, "the northeastern corner. My father wanted her near the creek because she loved water." She looked at the property, the sweep of grass going golden in the September heat, the creek glinting silver in the distance. "That is part of why I will not sell it." Fletcher looked at her with those steady dark eyes. "I know," he said, and she believed he did. In the evenings, in the 2nd and 3rd week, they fell into a habit that neither of them formally arranged. After supper, which Clara took at the boarding house and Fletcher at the Copper Crown, or sometimes at Jim Tate's place, Fletcher would appear at the boarding house porch at around 7 o'clock, and they would sit, sometimes with Edith and sometimes alone, and they would talk. They talked about everything. About the law and its failures and its possibilities. About land and what it meant to people who had built their lives on it. about Clara's schooling in Houston, and the ways it had both helped and frustrated her, the education that had given her a vocabulary and a framework for her opinions, and a world that had then told her women's opinions were for private rooms. About Fletcher's years on the cattle trail before the judge, the landscape of the West that he had crossed on horseback, and the things it did to a person's sense of scale. She discovered that he had read more than she expected, the same way she had read more than most people expected of her. They had both read the same newspaper editorial about water rights and property law, and had both been independently irritated by the same paragraph. And the evening they discovered this coincidence, they talked for so long that Edith went to bed, and the stars crossed a quarter of the sky and neither of them noticed, until the night air turned properly cool. Clara walked upstairs to her room that night with a feeling she had not had in some time, something warm and unsettling under her sternum, and she sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the wall and thought carefully. She had been told, by men she had tried to love, that she was too much. Too certain, too unwilling to make herself smaller, too in love with her own ideas. She had been told it enough times that she had begun to wonder, in her quieter moments, whether they were all wrong or whether there was something in her that genuinely resisted being loved. Some sharp edge that cut whatever came close. Fletcher was not cut. Fletcher came close and stood his ground and looked at her the way you look at something you are genuinely interested in understanding, not impressed by, or intimidated by, or charmed by, just genuinely interested, which was the rarest thing she had ever experienced. It was more intimate than flattery. It was more frightening than attraction. She told herself she was not falling in love. She told herself she was grateful and possibly fond, and that was entirely different. She did not quite believe herself. The tension with Holt came to a head in the third week, on a Thursday, in a way she had not anticipated. She arrived at the property in the morning to find the fence on the northern boundary cut. Not strained or damaged, cut. Clean diagonal cuts on the wire in 3 places, and the posts on either side of the cuts had been removed entirely and were missing. 20 feet of fence line was simply gone. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. Then she went into the house and sat on the stone hearth of her father's fireplace and put her head in her hands and let herself be angry for exactly 4 minutes, which was how long she had always given herself. 4 minutes to feel the full force of it. Then she lifted her head and began thinking. She went to find Fletcher. He was at the county recorder's office going through filing records. He took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him about the fence. His expression went very quiet and very controlled, which she had come to understand meant he was genuinely furious. "I want to go look at it," he said. "I know. Come on." They rode out and he examined the cuts and the missing posts with the same careful attention he gave everything and he wrote in his notebook for a long time. Then he said, "This is deliberate destruction of property. I can add this to the affidavit. Combined with the displaced survey markers and the intimidation at the boarding house, we have a solid case for the judge." "That is weeks away," Clara said. "He will do something worse before then." "Yes," Fletcher said. "He probably will." She looked at him. There was something in the quality of the silence between them, a thing that had been building for 3 weeks, a pressure, not unpleasant but demanding notice, and she was tired of being careful about it. "Fletcher," she said. He looked at her. "When you said good." "That night in the sheriff's office, when you said good about me being difficult to love." He waited. "Did you mean it the way you said? Or was it something you said in the moment?" He was quiet for long enough that she started to compose her response to the wrong answer, but then he said, "I meant it exactly the way I said it. A woman who knows her own mind and won't be handled is not difficult. She's honest." Men who can't manage that call it difficult because it's easier than admitting they can't manage it. Clara looked at the broken fence line. The morning was bright and still, and the meadowlark was back somewhere to the south. I have been told a great many times that I am the problem. I know you have, Fletcher said. I don't think you are. You've known me 3 weeks. 3 weeks in interesting circumstances is worth about a year of ordinary ones, he said. I know you're more competent than most people I have worked with, male or female. I know you're fair. I know when you are angry you go quiet instead of loud, which is unusual and useful. I know you don't ask for things you don't need, and you ask directly for the things you do. I know you're funny when you decide to be, which you clearly decide is worth doing occasionally when the situation calls for it. And I know you ride better than most working cowboys I have met on the trail. He paused. That is not nothing. Clara looked at him for a moment and felt the warm, unsettling thing in her chest resolve itself into something clearer and more honest. I am not asking you to rescue me, she said. I know that. I'm not trying to. Then what are you trying to do? Fletcher looked at her with that steady, direct attention. I'm trying to stay near someone worth staying near. He paused again. If that's all right. The morning air was warm, and the grass smelled green, and something in Clara Merritt settled into a new configuration, like a compass needle swinging to true north and holding. It's all right, she said. They repaired the fence together that day, bringing lumber from the wagon and spending 6 hours in the September heat working through the damaged section. They did not speak much about what had been said. They did not need to. There was a different quality to the silence now, the ease of 2 people who have been honest with each other and found it survivable. That evening, riding back to town, Fletcher said, Holt will likely make a move before the judge arrives. He'll want to push hard enough that you feel your position is untenable. What do you expect him to try? He'll go after something you can't replace. The house, maybe, or something more personal. He looked at her. Where is your mother's grave, northeast corner? I put a fence around it when I first arrived. Small one. Show me tomorrow. The next morning they rode out early and he examined the fence around her mother's grave with a thoroughness that moved her, noting where it was secure and where it could be reinforced. It was a small enclosure, perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet, with a wooden marker that her father had made himself, weathered now but still standing. There were wildflowers growing at the base of it, volunteers, the kind that come and go with the season. Fletcher stood at the fence and was quiet for a moment. Your father made this. Yes, it's good work. He was a careful man, Clara said, about the things that mattered. She felt the old familiar grief, not sharp anymore, just present, the way it becomes after enough time. He wrote me letters for 10 years about this land, about the house he was building and the creek and the grass. He wanted me to see it as a good place. He worked very hard to make it worth inheriting. It is, Fletcher said. I know. She looked at the marker. I just wish he had gotten to see it finished. Fletcher was beside her, and he put his hand on hers where it rested on the fence post, briefly, just the warmth of it, and then gone. But she felt it like something important, like a door opening quietly in a room she had kept closed for a long time. Holt moved on a Sunday. They were not expecting Sunday. It was the kind of calculation a man makes when he wants to avoid witnesses, knowing that most people in Red Rock would be at the small church at the end of the main street in the morning and the saloon in the afternoon. Fletcher was at Jim Tate's place discussing the situation. Clara was at the property. She had gone alone, which she knew Fletcher would not have approved of, but she had woken early and needed to work and did not want to wait for accompaniment. She had patience, and she had her father's old rifle, a Winchester that she could fire accurately at a distance that would discourage most problems, and she had arrived at the house to find a note nailed to the front door. The note was from Holt. It was not subtle. "Sell to me by end of week, or I will ensure this property burns before winter. You cannot stay here alone, and every man in this county knows it. Your father should have sold when he had the chance. Go back to wherever women like you go when they run out of places to make trouble." She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she folded it with precise, careful movements and put it in her pocket and went inside the house and stood in the main room her father had built and breathed. She was not going to burn. She was not going to sell. She was not going to leave. She was, however, going to go get Fletcher. She did not have to go far. He was riding up the boundary road as she came out, having apparently decided Sunday morning was a good time to check on things. He saw her face and pulled up. "What happened?" She handed him the note. He read it. The quiet that came over his face was different this time, deeper and colder, and he read it a second time and folded it and put it in his coat pocket with the deliberate care of a man taking charge of evidence. "He's confessed to property destruction in writing," he said. "I noticed." "And threatened arson." "I noticed that too." Fletcher looked at her. "Are you all right?" "I am furious," Clara said, "but I am not frightened, not of him." Something shifted in his expression, something that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one, something that had warmth in it, and something that looked very much like admiration. "I'm going to ride to Calhoun today," he said. "I'm going to put this note in the judge's hands personally and tell him to come now, not in 2 weeks, now. That is a 2-day ride at minimum. I can do it in a day and a half." He paused. "I don't want to leave you here alone." "You are not leaving me alone," Clara said. "You are going to get the judge. I am staying on my land." "Clara, I will stay with Edith at night. During the day I will work in full view of the road. I have the rifle and I know how to use it. Holt wants to frighten me off. If I stay visible and clearly not frightened, it complicates his ability to claim in court that he was simply making an offer and I misunderstood." She looked at him steadily. "I have thought this through." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know you have," he said. "Stay visible. Stay with Edith after dark, and if anything happens, Jim Tate is at the livery and he will help you." "I know." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small brass compass on a chain. "My father gave me this when I started trail work. It's been with me a long time." He held it out. "I know you don't need it. I just want you to have something of mine with you while I'm gone." Clara looked at the compass. It was old, the brass worn smooth at the edges from years of being handled. She took it and held it in her palm, and the needle swung and found north and held. "Come back quickly," she said. "Fast as I can," he said, and turned the bay north. The day and a half he was gone were, Clara would later consider, some of the longest hours she had spent. She did what she had said she would do. She worked the property in daylight, repairing the remaining fence sections, beginning to patch the damaged roof shingles using material she had finally received from the mill. She was visible from the road. She worked steadily and did not look over her shoulder more than was practical. Holt's men rode the boundary road twice on Monday. She watched them and did not wave and did not stop working. On Monday evening, Gerald Holt himself appeared at the boarding house. Edith did not open the door to him. She spoke through it. "Clara Merritt is not here for your conversation," Edith said through the door. "And I have my shotgun, and I have been looking for an excuse to fire it for 9 years. He left. Clara, upstairs, sat with Fletcher's compass in her hand and thought about what she was going to say when he came back, how she was going to say it, and whether she was going to be careful about it or simply honest. She decided on honest. She had always been honest. It was the thing that made her difficult, according to the men who found her too much. She was beginning to think it was also the thing that would eventually make her loved the right way, by the right person. Fletcher and Judge Albright arrived in Red Rock on Tuesday evening, 5 hours before sunset. The judge was a man of 60, white-haired and broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room and the intelligence to use it correctly. He had 2 deputies with him and a saddlebag full of papers. Clara met them in front of the boarding house. She was still in her work clothes from the day, her hair pinned back with more practicality than elegance, a smudge of roofing pitch on her left wrist. She did not apologize for any of it. "Miss Merritt," Judge Albright said, shaking her hand, "I've heard a great deal about this situation. I'd like to hear it from you directly." "I'd like to tell it to you directly," she said. "Come in." She laid out the case over an hour at Edith's kitchen table, methodically and with reference to every document she had, which was organized in a leather folder she had put together over the past 3 weeks with a thoroughness that visibly impressed the judge. The deed, the survey comparison, the affidavit about the markers, the copy of Holt's note, the record of the fence destruction, the dates and details of the intimidation at the boarding house. Fletcher sat to her left and contributed details where she needed them and was otherwise quiet, which was exactly what she needed. Judge Albright looked at the folder of evidence and then looked at Clara and said, "Miss Merritt, in 15 years on the bench I have not often seen a private citizen build a case this well." "I had help," Clara said, looking at Fletcher. "She did most of it herself," Fletcher said. "What happens now?" Clara asked the judge. "Now I issue an injunction preventing any sale or transfer of this property pending review. Then I summon Gerald Holt for a formal hearing tomorrow morning. Then I examine his land records and his bank records, which I have already requested through the county, and if they show what I think they are going to show, we proceed to formal charges." He folded his hands on the table. "This is not going to be comfortable for the next few days. Holt will not take the injunction well. He won't take it at all if he can help it," Edith said from the kitchen doorway, where she had been listening with her arms crossed. "He's a man who has gotten his way for 8 years. Men like that don't accept the word no without a scene." "Then we will be prepared for a scene," said Judge Albright. The hearing the next morning was held in the county hall, which was also the room used for town meetings, which meant it had chairs for perhaps 50 people. 60 showed up. Red Rock, Clara thought, watching them file in, had been waiting to see which way the wind blew. And apparently the arrival of a judge with deputies had been sufficient indication. Gerald Holt came with a lawyer, a man from Fort Worth named Gassett, who had the look of someone accustomed to courtrooms where the outcome was negotiated before the proceedings began. Holt himself was dressed well, and wearing the particular expression of a man who still believes the situation can be retrieved. He looked at Clara as he sat down, and she looked back at him, and she held his gaze until he looked away. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Judge Albright was methodical and patient and thorough, and Fletcher testified about the survey markers and the fence and the evidence he had gathered, and Clara testified about everything else, including the note, and the note was read aloud, and the room was very quiet when the part about burning was read. Holt's lawyer objected and argued and created noise, but Gassett had been hired to win, and the evidence was not winnable against. By 2 in the afternoon, the judge had issued a formal finding of fraudulent boundary interference, destruction of property, and criminal intimidation, and Holt was remanded to the custody of the deputies, pending formal charges to be filed in district court. Sheriff Cruz, who had been sitting in the back of the room with the expression of a man watching his comfortable arrangement dissolve, left shortly before the finding was read. Judge Albright noted his departure and made a note in his own book about that too. Clara walked out of the county hall into the afternoon sunshine, and stood on the steps and breathed. The street was busy with people who had been at the hearing, and were now dispersing in the manner of people who have witnessed something significant, and are processing what it means for their immediate world. Fletcher came out behind her and stood on the step below her so their eyes were at the same level. "It's done," he said. "For now," she said. "There will be a trial. There will. And you will need to be there, but the land is safe." "Yes." She looked at the street, at the ordinary world of Red Rock going about its day, the livery and the general store and the boarding house and the small church at the end of the road. "I keep waiting to feel more relief. What do you feel instead?" She thought about it honestly, because she always thought about things honestly even when it was inconvenient. "I feel like I want to go home," she said, "to the property, to my father's house." "Then let's go," Fletcher said. They rode out together in the late afternoon, and the property was golden and still in the September light, and the creek glinted, and the grass moved, and her mother's grave was peaceful and intact on the northeast corner. The house was still unfinished on the roof on the western side, and the list of work remaining was long, and the nearest town was 4 miles away, and it was all hers. She went and stood in the main room with the late light coming through the cracked window pane, and felt the presence of her father in the careful stone of the fireplace, and the solid plank of the floor, and the bones of the house he had built for her. She heard Fletcher on the porch. She went to the doorway. "What happens after the trial?" she asked. "With you." He stood with his hat in his hands, which was the only time she had ever seen him look anything other than entirely self-possessed, and the vulnerability of that detail was unexpectedly affecting. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On what you want." He looked at her directly. "I have been trying to be careful because you have had men in your life who pushed when they should have given space, and I didn't want to be another one of those, but I should have said more than I have." "Say it now," Clara said. He was quiet for a moment, gathering himself, and then he said it simply and without performance, which was exactly how she needed to hear it. "I am not going to walk away from you. Not because you need someone to stay, and not because you can't manage alone, because you clearly can. But because I have spent 3 weeks learning who you are, and I want to spend considerably longer at it. Because you are the most genuinely interesting person I have encountered in memory. And because you don't need me to make yourself smaller, and I don't want you to. And because, when I thought about riding to Calhoun and back, and the 2 days I wouldn't see you, I spent a considerable amount of that ride thinking about what it would be like if that distance were permanent, and I did not like what I found." Clara looked at him on her father's porch in her father's late light. "I am not easy," she said. "Good," he said. And this time he was looking right at her when he said it, and she could see exactly what he meant by it, that he was not saying easy like it was a virtue he was giving up. He was saying he understood that easy had never been the point, and that what she was instead was worth it. She stepped forward and took his face in her hands, which were not soft hands, which were the hands of a woman who had been working in the sun for weeks. And she kissed him on her father's porch as the September evening came down over the Texas grass, and he kissed her back with the same steadiness he brought to everything, careful and complete, like something he had been meaning to do and was finally doing right. They stood on the porch for a long time after. The meadowlark had gone quiet with the evening, and the creek sounded in the distance, and the stars were beginning to come up in the east. "There is a lot of work still to do on this house," Clara said. "I know. I was planning to do it alone." "I know you were. I could still do it alone." "You could," Fletcher said. "But I'm a good hand with a roof, and I have an honest opinion about window placement, and I would very much like to not be somewhere else while this house gets finished." Clara looked at the half-done roof, and the cracked window pane, and the enormous amount of work that stood between her and winter. She looked at the man beside her, who had come into her land dispute with a notebook and a measuring cord and had stayed because he wanted to, not because she asked him to, not because she needed rescuing, but because he had decided she was worth staying for. "All right," she said. "But I lead on the roof. I have been thinking about the western side for 2 weeks and I know what it needs." "I defer entirely," Fletcher said, with complete sincerity. She believed him. The trial came 6 weeks later in November in the district court in Calhoun County. It lasted 3 days, and Clara testified twice, and Fletcher testified once, and the evidence from the affidavits and the note and the land records, which had indeed shown a pattern of fraudulent acquisition across 4 properties in 8 years, was laid out before the jury with the careful precision that Judge Albright had promised. Gerald Holt was convicted on 3 counts and sentenced to 4 years in the state penitentiary. His lawyer appealed. Clara was told the appeal would likely take a year and was unlikely to succeed. Sheriff Cruz, whose arrangement with Holt had been made clear in the trial, resigned from office before formal charges could be filed and left Red Rock entirely, which was the kind of practical cowardice that Clara found unsatisfying but not surprising. A new election was scheduled for the spring. The 2 homesteading families Holt had pressured into selling were not able to recover their land, which was the injustice that sat with Clara for a long time, the way injustice does when it has been partially but not fully corrected. She wrote a letter to Judge Albright about the possibility of challenging those sales, citing the conviction as evidence of a pattern, and the judge wrote back that he was considering it and would keep her informed. There was a different shape to the work after the trial. With the legal threat resolved, with the land secure, the work on the house became something other than urgent necessity. It became, quietly and without announcement, something else. Fletcher had stayed in Red Rock. He had sent a report to Judge Albright, and the judge had replied with his thanks, and the information that there was another matter in a county to the north that would need attention in the new year, but that there was no urgency in the short term. Fletcher had moved from the Copper Crown to a room at Jim Tate's place, which was more comfortable and considerably quieter. He was at the property every day. He had been, without discussion, for 3 weeks before the trial and continued after. The roof on the western side was finished in October, a solid job that Clara inspected from the inside when the first rain came and found entirely watertight. The window panes were replaced, both cracked ones, and one she found had a hidden crack she hadn't noticed. The shutter that had bothered her was rehung. The chimney was cleaned and tested and threw no smoke into the main room. The house became livable in stages, the way houses do when the people working on them are paying attention to what livable really means. Clara moved from the boarding house to the property in late October, which Edith received with a mixture of practical understanding and what seemed very much like maternal pride. "You'll come to dinner Sunday," Edith told her. It was not a question. "Every Sunday," Clara promised. The propriety of Clara at the property and Fletcher spending considerable daylight hours there was, in Red Rock, a topic of observation and various opinions. Clara was aware of this and did not concern herself with it beyond the practical, which was that she was on her land, and he was helping her work it, and there was nothing in that arrangement that required anyone else's approval. Fletcher was equally unconcerned, which she found deeply satisfying. They were, however, careful in the ways that mattered in 1878 Texas, because neither of them was interested in creating complications where none needed to exist. He did not stay after dark. She did not ask him to. What they were to each other existed in the hours between, in the work side by side and the evenings on the porch, and the conversations that had become, over months, The kind of conversations where you say the true things, because the person across from you has established over time that they can hold the weight of them. She told him about Thomas Greaves on a November evening, sitting on the porch with blankets because the evenings had gone cold. She had not planned to tell it. It came out because they had been talking about the people who shape you, and she had mentioned Abilene without thinking, and it unfurled from there. She told it plainly. The 8 months, and the hat, and the gentle, regretful voice, and Dora who smiled constantly. Fletcher listened without comment until she was done. "Did you love him?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "I thought I did. I think I loved the version of him that I believed he was before he became the version that needed me to be smaller." She looked at the dark yard, the star-crowded sky. "That's a more complicated answer than yes." "It's a more accurate one," Fletcher said. She looked at him. "Did you ever come close? With anyone?" He was quiet for a moment. "There was a woman in Calhoun when I first started working for the judge. We were together for about a year. She was kind and she wanted a settled life, a house and a husband who came home at regular hours and knew where he would be the following year. I could not give her that then, and I knew it. We ended it honestly and without cruelty, and she married a man she seems very happy with." He paused. "I did not know what I was looking for then. I think I have a better idea now." She did not ask him to elaborate. She knew. On a December morning, 4 months after she had arrived in Red Rock, Fletcher came to the property earlier than usual. She was in the kitchen, which had a proper stove now, a second-hand one from the general store that she had purchased and installed with Jim Tate's help, making coffee. He knocked on the open door and came in and stood in the kitchen doorway with an expression she did not immediately recognize. He was holding something, a small object wrapped in a piece of cloth. "What is that?" she asked. "Something I've been carrying around for 3 weeks trying to find the right moment to give you." He held it out. "I don't think there is a right moment. I think there's just this one." She unwrapped it. Inside was a ring, simple gold, with a small turquoise stone set in it, the kind of stone that came from the New Mexico territory, blue-green and warm as summer water. She looked at it for a long time. "I am not asking you to need me," Fletcher said, and his voice was steady and his eyes were steady, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and lay across his hands. "I know you don't. I'm asking you to want me around, on purpose, for the indefinite future." He paused. "I am asking you to marry me, Clara, because you are the first person I have ever wanted to be with consistently, not in spite of who you are but entirely because of it, and because I think we could build something here that is worth building." Clara looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about the compass needle finding north and holding. "You understand what you are agreeing to," she said. "I will have opinions about everything. I will argue when I disagree. I will not be made smaller for anyone's comfort." "I know," Fletcher said. "I am counting on it." She put the ring on her finger. It fit. She had not asked how he knew the size. She thought she might ask later, and then thought it was the kind of detail that was simply right, the way some things are when you have found the right person. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, and she met him halfway, which seemed appropriate, and he held her face the way she had held his that evening on the porch, and kissed her in the winter kitchen, with the coffee going strong and the turquoise ring warm on her hand. They were married in March of 1879, in the small church at the end of Red Rock's Main Street, with Edith Farlow as witness and Jim Tate as the other, and Judge Albright making the trip from Calhoun because, as he put it, he had contributed to the circumstances and felt a responsibility to see them properly concluded. The spring day was mild and bright, the kind of Texas morning that feels like a promise. Clara wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool she had ordered from the dry goods store, simple and well cut and exactly what she wanted. Fletcher wore his clean coat and clean boots and had his hat in his hands, and looked at her walking down the short aisle of the small church with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not awe exactly. It was recognition. The particular look of a man seeing clearly the thing he has been moving toward and finding it exactly as he believed it would be. She did not cry. She was not a crying woman at significant moments, which she knew some people found strange. She felt the weight of it fully, the importance of it, the shift in what her life was going to be, and she carried that weight with both hands, forward. When the minister asked if she took this man, she looked Fletcher directly in the eyes and said, "I do," with the same clear certainty she brought to everything that mattered. Judge Albright hosted a dinner at the Copper Crown after. Edith brought a cake. Jim Tate played fiddle tolerably well. Several people from Red Rock who had waited and watched, and then quietly, after the trial, become friendly came and wished them well, which Clara accepted with more grace than she had thought she would feel. The two homesteading families, she learned that spring, had a chance at recovering their land after all. Judge Albright had found a legal pathway through the fraud conviction, and both families were pursuing it. It would take time, and it was not certain. But the possibility was there, and Clara had written letters of support and offered to testify if needed. And the judge had confirmed that the Merritt case had established important precedent. She held that knowledge the way she held the things she could do but not fix completely, in her open hand rather than her closed fist. Fletcher's work for the judge took him away in April, to the county to the north that had been waiting. He was gone for 6 weeks, which was the first long separation, and Clara worked the property and established its first season's planting and corresponded with her cousin Margaret in Amarillo, who was full of congratulations and questions, and had always been the person Clara was most honest with outside of Fletcher. She missed him steadily, the way you miss something that has become fundamental, not desperately, just constantly, the way you notice the absence of something that was supposed to be there. She wrote him long letters, and he wrote back letters that were shorter but contained more per word than she expected, which was characteristic of him. He came back in June, leaner from the road, and when he rode up to the house and got off the bay and she came off the porch to meet him, they stood in the yard with the summer heat coming off the grass and held each other with the full force of 6 weeks and the knowledge of the future, which was going to contain more separations, because that was what his work required. "I thought about it on the road," he said into her hair. "What it costs, me being away. I can manage the property," she said. "I know you can. That's not what I meant." He pulled back to look at her. "I want to know if it's too much for you, me being gone." She thought about this honestly, which was the only way she knew to think. "It is hard," she said. "I do not like it, but it is what your work is, and your work is part of who you are, and I would not ask you to give up who you are." She paused. "But I want to know when you will be back. Not just an estimate, a real date when you can give me one, and I want you to write when you can." "I can do that," he said. "Then we will be all right," she said, and they were. It took practice, the way most things that are worth having take practice. The separations were real, and the missing was real, and sometimes the letters were not enough, and she would stand in the kitchen at night after the work was done, and feel the size of his absence in a way that was almost physical. But she had built her life on the property with her own hands and her own judgment, and it was a real and substantial life. And when he came back, it was not rescue or relief but addition, the way you add something valuable to something that is already good. In the autumn of 1879, she told him that she was expecting a child. She told him on the porch in the evening, matter-of-factly, because she was not a woman who built toward announcements. She was looking at her list of fall work when she said, "Fletcher, I am going to have a child in the spring." He went very still. She looked at him. He had an expression she had not seen before, which was layered and complicated and which resolved slowly into something that looked like the deepest kind of joy, the kind that is too big to be loud and so comes out quietly. "In the spring," he said. "April, I think. I talked to the doctor in Calhoun last week." "Last week," he said. I wanted to be certain before I said anything. He looked at her for a long moment. "Are you all right?" "I am quite well. I will probably be less patient with things that require patience in the coming months." "That is a fair warning." He laughed, which was the laugh she had learned to love most, the one that came out when she said something that genuinely landed, full and warm and completely unguarded. He took her hand and held it. "A child," he said. "Yes, on this land. On this land. Where my mother is buried and my father built his house." Fletcher was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I want to write to my parents and tell them." "Write to them," Clara said. He wrote that evening, a long letter to New Mexico, and his mother wrote back within the week with a response full of warmth and practical advice, and the information that she intended to come to Texas in the spring if Clara would have her. Clara wrote back and said she would very much have her, and she meant it, because she had been alone with her own competence for a long time, and she understood the difference between needing help and accepting it from people who offered it freely and with love. Fletcher's mother arrived in March. Her name was Helen Boone. She was 54 years old. She was a practical woman who had spent her life on ranches and had the kind of intelligence that showed in how quickly she assessed a situation, and the wisdom to keep her assessments to herself, unless asked. She and Clara liked each other within the first hour, which was the quiet, mutual recognition of two women who did not have patience for performance. The baby came in April, on a morning when the Texas spring was at its most extravagant, the bluebonnets coming up along the creek bank, the sky an unreasonable blue. The labor was long, and Clara was, as she had predicted, not patient about it, but she was capable, and the doctor from Calhoun and Helen were both there, and when it was over she held her son. A boy, sturdy and red-faced and alive. Fletcher came in and looked at the baby and then at Clara with an expression that she kept and kept. He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby in his arms and watched him hold his child with careful, astonished hands. "What do you want to name him?" he asked. She had thought about it. "James, for my father," she paused. "James Henry Boone, if you agree to the Henry." "Henry was my grandfather," Fletcher said. "I know. Edith told me months ago." He looked at her with the laughter in his eyes. "You planned that?" "I made an inquiry," Clara said. They named him James Henry Boone, and he was loud and opinionated from approximately the second day, which Edith said when she came to visit was entirely to be expected given his parents, and which Clara found deeply, privately satisfying. Helen stayed through the summer, genuinely useful and genuinely loving and entirely without the kind of interference that Clara had half expected, and was grateful not to receive. She went back to New Mexico in September with the promise of returning, a promise she kept, and the baby went with her and Fletcher's father for 2 weeks the following spring, which gave Clara and Fletcher time that was their own, which they used working the land and reading on the porch and talking the way they talked best, the long, unhurried conversations that ranged across everything. The years passed with the texture of a life that is both ordinary and entirely the right one. James Henry grew up with his mother's opinions and his father's steadiness and both of their stubbornness, which made him simultaneously the most easy and most difficult child that Clara could have imagined, which she loved fiercely and said so frequently. The Holt appeal failed in 1880. The conviction stood. The homesteading families recovered their land through Judge Albright's continued effort, which Clara helped support with testimony and documents for more than a year. And both families returned to the county and built again, which was not justice in the fullest sense but was repair. And repair was sometimes what was available. Fletcher continued his work for the judge in varying measure, finding a balance as the years went on between the travel the work required and the life on the property, eventually taking a formal deputy marshal position that gave the work legal standing and, importantly, a salary and a defined scope. Clara ran the property with the assistance of a hired hand named Ellie, a young man of 20 who had come looking for work in 1881 with honest eyes and a willingness to learn, and the 40 acres became a working cattle operation on a modest scale, 40 head by 1882, enough to be real. Fletcher read that letter and said, "You should have been a lawyer." "Women are not admitted to the bar," Clara said. "They should be," Fletcher said. "They will be," Clara said. "Someday." In the spring of 1882, Clara told Fletcher she was expecting again. This time she told him at breakfast, with James Henry at the table eating cornbread and making a mess of it, and Fletcher looked up from his coffee and smiled. A full, warm, unguarded smile that was 3 years more settled than the one she had first seen on him and somehow better for it. "When?" he asked. "November." "Good," he said. And this time the word landed entirely differently than the first good had landed. The first good in the sheriff's office that had begun everything, and yet the same. Something in Fletcher that found the word naturally when something pleased him, when something was right. The second child, born in a November of cold and clear skies, was another boy, which neither of them had expected. They named him William, for the simple reason that both of them liked the name. And William was from the first a quieter and more observant child than James Henry, taking after his father in temperament, which Clara watched with a wonder that never quite diminished. James Henry was 5 and greeted his brother with the ambivalence of a firstborn, and then, over 3 weeks, was converted entirely, and became the most devoted older brother Clara had ever observed, which said something about who James Henry was underneath the opinions. The property became the house her father had imagined. She finished it herself, the details he had not gotten to, the proper porch railing and the kitchen shelving, and eventually a second room added to the back when it became clear the family had outgrown the 2 original ones. The stone fireplace her father had built was the center of the house, and in the evenings in winter the whole family was in the main room around it, Fletcher reading or working on his case notes, Clara writing her letters and her lists, and the occasional formal correspondence that had become, quietly over years, a small reputation in the county for clear thinking on water and land issues. She kept her mother's grave well. Every season there were wildflowers, and she maintained the small fence, and she brought the boys when they were old enough and told them about their grandmother, who had loved water, and their grandfather, who had built everything around them with his hands. James Henry took this seriously in the way of a child, who understands that history is a real thing that lives in the place you stand. William put his hand on the wooden marker and said nothing for a long time, and then asked very quietly if the dead could hear you. And Clara said she thought sometimes they could, and William nodded as if this was information he would work with. Fletcher's parents visited twice a year and stayed for weeks, and his father, whose name was Robert Boone, helped with the cattle the way a man helps who was born to it and still loves it. And his mother and Clara had the kind of friendship that women find sometimes. The deep, practical friendship between people who like each other precisely as they are and expect nothing to be different. In 1883, the 2 homesteading families held a joint gathering in June, on the land they had recovered, and they invited everyone who had helped them get it back. which included Clara and Fletcher and Judge Albright and various others. And Clara stood on the recovered land with a cup of cider and watched the family's children run through the grass and felt something complete in her chest. Not perfect, because perfection is not available in an honest life, but complete. Edith Farlow sold the boarding house in 1884 and came to live in Red Rock's newly extended residential street. And she and Clara had Sunday dinners every week without fail. And Edith spoiled James Henry and William in the particular way of a woman who never had children of her own and knows what she missed and makes it count. One evening in the autumn of 1884, Clara and Fletcher were on the porch in the last light. James Henry was 7 and William was 2, and both were asleep inside. The land lay before them, 40 acres of grass in the gold evening, the creek bright in the distance, her mother's grave peaceful on the northeast corner, the house solid around them. "Are you happy?" Fletcher asked. She thought about it, which was her way. "Yes," she said. Then, because she was an honest woman, not always simply, but yes. "That's what I thought," he said. He was looking at the land, the long, familiar look of a man who knows a place by heart. "I think about that first night sometimes, in the sheriff's office." "Good," she said and laughed. He looked at her. "I thought you were the most certain person I had ever met." "I was frightened," she said. "I know, it didn't look like it. It never does." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was a thing she did now without thinking about it, the way you do with the people who have become the landscape of your daily life. That was the point. He put his arm around her, his steady hand on her shoulder, and they watched the last light go from the Texas sky in the way it does, slowly and then all at once, the colors moving through rose and gold and the deep red that she had never seen anywhere else. That specific red that lived in the West Texas evening and was one of the reasons you stayed. The stars came up. The creek talked in the distance. The house was warm and lit behind them, the home her father had begun and she had finished. And inside it were her sons and the life she had built with her own stubborn, certain, difficult hands. And beside her was the man who had looked at all of that and said good, and meant it every time. She thought about the women who had come before her on this land and the women who would come after, on this land and on other lands, who would be told they were too much, too difficult, too unwilling to be made small. And she thought that the answer to all of it was not to be less, but to find the people who understood that what they were calling difficult was something else entirely. That it was honesty, that it was wholeness, that it was a woman who knew the shape of herself and refused to allow that shape to be compressed for anyone's comfort, that it was, in the end, lovable. Deeply, completely, sustainably lovable to the right person in the right way. Not in spite of what she was, because of it. She closed her hand around Fletcher's and felt the gold of her ring in the dark, the turquoise stone warm from her skin, and she thought, my father's land, my mother's grave, my sons asleep inside, my husband beside me, my work in the world, my life mine. "Come inside," she said. "It's getting cold." They went in together, and the door closed behind them on the wide Texas night, and the stars turned and the creek ran and the meadowlark would come back in the morning, and everything was exactly as it was supposed to be.